This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means? It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop Black Friday week deals now.
Rated T to M. Hey, want to hear a PC Game Pass ad? I'll take your silence as a yes. Want new games on day one like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 or Stalker 2? I thought so. How about unlocking all the League of Legends champions when you link your Riot Games account? All for one low monthly price? Well, guess what? We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Stalker 2 available November 20th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. And that's the end of the script.
Settler colonialism. It's one of the buzzwords of the day, and if you think it came out of nowhere, well then, think again. Hello, welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. We've been hearing this term, settler colonialism, increasingly since last October 7th. If you've been paying attention on university and college campuses over the past few years, you were probably already somewhat familiar with it, and other terms like decolonization, white settler colonialism, and names of that nature. But where did they come from? Is it a new phenomenon? Absolutely not. That's something that our next guest here on the Full Comment Podcast examines in his book. It's called On Settler Colonialism. Adam Kirsch is an editor at the Wall Street Journal and joins me now. Adam, fascinating book, interesting book, disturbing book, but one that's needed because I've been looking at this term for a while, but I'm one of those people that looks at crazy things that happen on university campuses and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should pay attention to this. And people, oh, no, that's just the campus. Well, as Professor Gad Sad said to me recently, what starts in the social science faculty does not stay in the social science faculty, and it spreads. So tell me about where this idea, an ideology really, came from and how it's impacting not only what's going on in Israel now, but Canada and the United States, to the point where some people are saying everyone that's not Indigenous should be leaving now.
Sure. Well, thank you for what you say about the book, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's true. This is an idea that I think when most people first encounter it, the idea of settler colonialism and the sort of conclusions that people draw from it might strike them as eccentric or sort of just purely academic. But the reason why I wanted to write this book, and it's a short book, was written in the aftermath of October 7th last year, was because I saw that when people were sort of responding positively to the Hamas attack on Israel that killed 1,200 people, mostly civilians, there were people, as we saw at the time, before the Israeli response, before the invasion of Gaza, people were celebrating this. As soon as the news came, they were celebrating it. And they were mainly people in academia or in progressive groups, activist groups. And what I noticed is that many of these people use the term settler colonialism or settler colonial in the statements that they issued approving of the Hamas attack. They said things like Israel is a settler colony, or this is resistance to settler colonialism, or as one person said, the people killed in Israel were not civilians, they were settlers, and therefore they were valid targets. And it seemed to me that this is one of those cases where an idea that started out in the academy was really starting to emerge into the public sphere and affect real-life political debates. And I think that as the debate and protests over Israel and Palestine have been going on since then, over the last year plus, the term settler colonialism has become more and more widespread and more important. So what I try to do in this book, which is a sort of a short introduction, is just to look at the genealogy of this idea, where it comes from, what some of the implications are that people draw from it for the history of the United States and Canada, and then finally for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, we've got people protesting outside events. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper was getting an award from Toronto's Jewish community, and people standing outside saying that they're protesting it because, obviously Zionist and Zionism, and they've got to denounce that, but they're also denouncing so-called Canada.
We're standing in the face of an event that is celebrating the despicable relationship between so-called Canada and the criminal state of Israel.
Now, when I heard that, I thought, okay, they're taking what's being used against Israel, and they're now drawing it back to here. But in the book, you say it really started with Australians moved to Canada and the U.S., and is now being applied to Israel. Do people really go so far as to say we should all be leaving? You cite a paper in the Wang Yang and Eve Tuck. Eve Tuck is a University of Toronto professor. I guess she's about to move to NYU, but she's at the Ontario Institute, or has been the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Very radical school. And the quote that you have in the book says, settler colonization can be visually understood as the unbroken pace of invasion and settler occupation into native lands. Decolonization as a process would repatriate land to Indigenous peoples, reversing the timeline of these changes. They really do believe, give all the land back and go back. I don't know where we'd all go back to where we came from, but that's not a metaphor is the term they use, right?
Right. That's a very influential paper in this field, this academic field of settler colonial studies, called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it gets to one of the sort of key questions. I hadn't heard so-called Canada, but it expresses a sort of basic insight into how settler colonial studies views the history of these countries, primarily or originally Australia, Canada, and the U.S., countries settled by the British, and then sort of by extension Israel, which is now the one that's most in the news and probably most talked about. The idea that it's so-called Canada, it expresses the idea that these countries are not legitimate, that they should not have existed, and in some sense can never become legitimate. So I think that one of the key distinction for settler colonial theory is it doesn't tell us anything about the history of these countries that we don't already know, right? Everyone who learns the history of these countries starting in elementary school knows they were founded by British and French colonists who came to North America or Australia and eventually, over generations, took the land from the people who had been living there, from Native Americans, First Nations people, Aboriginal Australians, and created new societies there. So that is sort of not a controversial statement. What's controversial is the idea that, as Patrick Wolfe, who's an Australian anthropologist who's often considered the founder of this school of thought, said, invasion is a process, not an event. That's a line that's often quoted. And what he meant by that is you might think that the invasion of Australia by the British is something that took place in 1788, or the colonization of North America in Massachusetts is something that happened in the early 17th century, more than 400 years ago. But in this way of looking at things, these are ongoing processes, so that everyone and everything created in the aftermath of these invasions is itself still part of the invasion. And what that means is that America, Australia, Canada can never really be legitimate sovereigns over their territory. They're always what people disparage as settler colonies, which means that they were created by force, they're here and maintained by force, and that in an ideal future they would cease to exist. Now, it's impossible, even I think for most advocates of this idea, to actually envision in concrete terms what it would mean for these countries to cease to exist. The term settler colonialism was originally applied to countries like Algeria and Rhodesia in the decolonization period after World War II. And in those places, when you say you're fighting for decolonization, it's a very concrete goal. It means something like 10% of the population in Algeria and Rhodesia were European. They had all the power and the land and the money. And the idea was that by decolonizing, you were going to expropriate them, return the power and the money and the land to the 90% of the people who are the native population. And that is basically what happened in Algeria. There was a long war. The French lost, and all the European settlers, almost all of them, left the country. But you can't imagine that outcome in Australia or North America, because in these countries, the indigenous population is only about 2% of the total. European settlement, and then settlement from other places is something that happened much longer ago and much more thoroughly. So if you talk about decolonizing the United States, for example, I'm American, and this is the part of it that I'm most familiar with, you can't really imagine a situation in which 98% of the American population pulls up and leaves, right? That's not going to happen.
Where would they go?
Where would they go? Exactly. I mean, when people in these countries think about themselves, traditionally, they do not think of themselves as settlers. Settlers is not a term that we would apply to ourselves because we're not the ones who settled the land. You might say the Pilgrims and the Puritans were settlers in the United States. But people who are here now don't think of themselves as settlers. But if you think of it as a binary distinction between settler and indigenous, so that you're either indigenous, meaning your ancestors were here before the Europeans arrived, or you're a settler, that means that everyone who's not indigenous is a settler, and that can include people who you might not think of as settlers at all. For example, in American history, many of these theorists would say descendants of African slaves are settlers because they're not indigenous and they occupy the position of a settler in this binary, so that even if they were slaves and did not choose to come to here, they are now settlers. Or the same is true if you're an immigrant who came here last year. You came on an airplane rather than on the Mayflower. You still are a settler because you occupy the settler position and not the indigenous position. So when you frame things in that way, it's basically impossible to imagine decolonization or the end of settlement. But I think one reason why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so important and so exciting to a lot of people in this field is that they see there a place where you could actually imagine the settlers, which for them means the Jews, being kicked out. The end of the settler state, which for them is Israel.
So just before we move on to focusing on Israel, just keeping it in North America for a moment, we had a protest about 2 months ago here in Toronto. A couple dozen schools from middle school, from grade 3 on, so elementary through middle school kids were taken to a protest. Now, the protest was ostensibly about a First Nations reserve in northern Ontario called Grassy Narrows. Their water supply in their region was poisoned by, I believe, a paper mill decades and decades ago. And so there's long calls for something needs to be done for the water, get rid of the mercury poison. And the kids are all told, and the parents who are approving of this are told, we are going to observe the protest but not participate. Not only did they participate, but at least one teacher, if not more, told the kids, wear blue to identify yourself as a settler, wear your native regalia if you're indigenous. That's down to grade 3. And then, of course, the confluence of this ideology and the anti-Semitism that is so rampant, while they're at a protest for water on a reserve in northern Ontario, but the protest is in downtown Toronto, they're chanting from Palestine to Turtle Island, occupation is a crime. So this has gone from theoretical academics down to grade 3 students being told, you're a settler, you're an occupier, and occupation is a crime.
Right, exactly. I mean, the whole term Turtle Island, which was sort of coined or popularized in the 1970s as a ostensibly authentic Native American term for North America, suggests that the things that are here now, things like Canada and the United States, are not real, that they're not what should be here. What should be here is Turtle Island, which is the way that Native Americans, First Nations people, thought of this continent. It's a spurious concept because, as I say in the book, before 1492, neither Europeans nor people living in North America had any concept of North America as a continent. There was no idea that this is something called Turtle Island. This was created by taking elements from certain people's creation myths and sort of turning it into this term. But it's a modern term. It's a 21st century term, not a sort of old authentic term. And what it means is that, as you say, that we are all occupiers on this land. In the same way that Israel occupies its land, Canada and the United States and Australia occupy land that really belongs to other people. And the consequences that flow from that are hard to discern sometimes. I mean, it doesn't exactly lead to a concrete political program, but it definitely leads to the idea that we should be ashamed of being here, that the civilization that we've created here is criminal, is sort of something that should be apologized for or atoned for. And that goes beyond the original settlement. I think what gives this idea its political appeal to those who do find it appealing is that it draws these lines from settlement to everything in contemporary society that one might want to protest. So people will say environmental damage, capitalism, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, that these are all sort of legacies of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism becomes, as I say in the book, it's almost a religious concept. It's sort of like original sin. It's saying because these countries were born in sin, they remain tainted by it in perpetuity.
Yeah, well, that was one of the notes that I'd made, was to ask you to expand on that, the idea that settler colonialism is the original sin of this movement. So, I'm very familiar with the term original sin. I'm sure most of the listeners are, but given the way societies move, some may not be. So fill me in on what you mean by that.
So original sin is a term in Christian theology, which is a way of interpreting the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, which says that when Adam and Eve sinned by eating from the tree that God had forbidden, that they committed the original sin, the first sin, and that they passed on that sin or the guilt for that sin to everyone afterwards, so that all of humanity is sort of tainted by that sin, bears that sin, and it's responsible for the reasons why we act sinfully ourselves. We live in a fallen world. We've fallen from Eden, and we're all sort of affected by this original sin. And it's not something that you or I did in the course of our own individual lives. It's sort of part of our condition as human beings, is that we are fallen, we're in sin. And that's why we need to repent, and we need God's grace in Christian thought in order to atone for this sin. It's a very similar way of thinking about settler colonial societies, in that it's not something that you or I did. You could be born hundreds of years after settlement took place. But if you're a settler, you are sort of responsible for and affected by this event that took place long before your birth. And the sort of terms of your spiritual and moral life are dictated by how you respond to this, how you atone for it, how you make up for what's sometimes called settler ways of being.
Well, you've touched on this a bit earlier, but it appears that we do continue to sin. As you write in the book, if settlement is a genocidal invasion, and invasion is an ongoing structure, not a completed event, then everything, and perhaps everyone, that sustains a settler colonial society today is also genocidal. I don't know how many times our prime minister has called Canada a genocidal state. He's very careful about referring to other events happening in other countries as genocide, but he's happy to say that we are a genocidal country. So it's gone all the way from grade 3 up to from university down to grade 3 up to the prime minister. This is a deeply embedded viewpoint in parts of our society.
Yeah, and I think that it's part of a larger debate. It's maybe the most extreme expression of a larger debate that is happening in America and Canada, and maybe in Europe as well, about history, about how we understand our history. For a long time, I think in the 19th century, if you look at the way American history was written, it was very patriotic and sort of saw the foundation of the United States as the hinge on which world history turned, the idea that the fate of liberty and self-government in the world depended on the United States. Then sort of Abraham Lincoln famously said that the Civil War was about whether government by the people would perish from the earth. In other words, America was the bearer of liberty for the entire planet. In a similar way, now I think the foundation of these countries and the colonization of North America is often described as the worst thing that ever happened. It was sort of a hinge of history that sent things in the wrong direction, that was responsible for introducing a lot of crime and sin and greed and unhappiness into the world, and that we have to sort of make up for it. And since we can't abolish ourselves physically, what we have to do is abolish what people call settler ways of being, which are all the things that we inherit from settlement, from colonialism, which are things like insatiability, rapacity, appetite, but also things like the desire for scientific progress, or for material improvements in life, or even in some cases, individualism. These are all seen as settler ways of being. They're legacies of European colonialism that we have to overcome in order to have a better future.
And as you mentioned earlier, of course, throw capitalism in there because, of course, we have to get rid of capitalism. It's evil. It improves lives. It improves living standards, but therefore is evil.
Well, it's definitely part of a bigger progressive critique. And one of the ironies is that one of the sort of main things that is charged to settler colonialism is despoiling the environment, right? So the idea that settlers came and they took more and more and more land and more resources, and that this is a sort of settler way of being versus indigenous ways of being, which live lightly on the land and don't take from the earth. Well, so there are people who will say, and I quote some of them in the book, if we want to reduce carbon emissions or stop global warming, we have to get rid of settler colonialism. Well, if you look at who are the biggest carbon emitters in the world, the United States is one of the top 5, and others are China and India, which are not settler colonial societies in the terms of this discourse. And in fact, in those societies, achieving industrial power and capitalist wealth are sort of signs of emancipation from colonialism. They're saying we're catching up with the West and going beyond the West. So if you think that the desire for, say, automobiles, right, or cheap manufactured goods or other things that consume natural resources is due to settler colonialism, it doesn't really explain the fact that everyone everywhere in the world wants and needs these things. It's a very ideological way of looking at reality, which leaves out a lot of the picture.
I'll ask you to comment on one idiosyncrasy before we take a break and then move on to how this applies to Israel, because it's disturbing what I see go by my window every single week. I'm sure I'll be seeing them later tonight or tomorrow with the screams of settler colonialism and take us back to 48. But it does strike me that so many of the people that buy into and propagate this theory also seem to believe that we should have open borders of immigration. And have you understood how they reconcile that this is all indigenous land, that anyone else being here is settler colonialism, but that we should throw the doors wide open?
Well, it's interesting. One of the you mentioned Eve Tuck at the beginning. I believe in that essay that I was talking about, decolonization is not a metaphor. She describes herself in the course of the essay as a trespasser, meaning she lives on land that she shouldn't be on. She sort of is a trespasser on native land. So if you have this idea that everyone has a certain piece of land that they are aboriginal to or indigenous to, and if you go to someone else's land, you're a trespasser, you sort of have to start to unravel the entire thread of world history, because everywhere you look, people have moved onto and taken, conquered, and settled on other people's land. And this concept can cut in lots of different ways. One of the examples in the book is in the American Southwest, it became a sort of slogan or rallying call in the 1960s for Latinos to say, we didn't cross the border crossed us, meaning that Mexico used to own the land that's now part of the southwestern U.S., so that when people came to the United States, they weren't crossing a border. They were sort of going to a land that had originally been Hispanic in the 19th century and earlier. Well, and that's true, of course, but then the Hispanic civilization there was also the result of settlement. It was the result of Spanish settlement and conquest. So if you keep going back and sort of looking at earlier points in history, everyone is a settler and a colonizer, depending on where you draw the line. And one of the things about land acknowledgments in particular is that they often take the form of saying that we, the institution making the acknowledgement, acknowledge the people who were on this land as the custodians of the land from time immemorial. Well, of course, all that really means is that those were the people who were there when Canadian American civilization encountered them. We have no way of knowing who occupied or who controlled any particular piece of land before that, because there are no records. And if you look at what we do know about Native American history, there was constant warfare, displacement, rise and fall of civilizations. So the idea that any group of people is indigenous to a place and has lived there since time immemorial is sort of fundamentally ahistorical. And I think that that's one reason why it's not really an enduring or lasting basis for a better future, because it rests on a myth, a historical myth.
The Six Nations Reserve that I grew up near, they were all settler colonialists who moved north with Joseph Brant from New York State after the American War of Independence. I do like how you described land acknowledgments in the book. You said, rather, these formulas serve to ritually renew the audience's responsibility for the act of dispossession in accordance with the settler colonial view of history. It reminds me of the group act of contrition in the old Latin Catholic Mass, where you strike your breast 3 times and say, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, except there is no absolution for the sin. You're just saying, I'm a sinner, over and over again. And there's no relief. You are just perpetually a sinner. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we will discuss how this theory is now being applied in Israel and is the basis for so many of the people who are supporting a terrorist group. Back in moments.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Settler colonialism, the idea that came out of the academy, took over college campuses, and as we discussed, elementary schools, now headed towards or being used against the state of Israel. Adam, I know this is an ongoing fight, but let's be honest, how anyone can say that Jews are not indigenous to that region, to Jerusalem, to Judea and Samaria, is obviously ignorant of history or wanting to rewrite it. But they are using the indigenous narrative, the settler colonial narrative, to try and erase Jewish history from the region of Israel. You know, predates the state in 1948.
Well, one of the sort of basic ideas of settler colonialism is that in every situation there's an indigenous and a colonizing population, and seen through that lens, Israel and Zionism is a white European colonial movement which came to dispossess a non-white native indigenous people. And that's the way of framing the conflict that Palestinian activists and leadership resisted for a long time. I say in the book that Yasser Arafat specifically said, "We are not red Indians," meaning he did not want people to think of Palestinians as being like Native Americans, because he thought that that was a defeatist approach, because in the end, Native Americans were defeated and lost their land, and he didn't want people to think the Palestinian struggle was analogous to that. But in a new generation, in the last 10, 15 years, I think younger people have started to see the idea of being an indigenous people as morally very powerful. So they are embracing the idea of Palestinians as an indigenous people and Jews as settler colonizers from Europe. You mentioned the sort of way that there's this odd confluence between Native American and Palestinian activism. In America, we saw that in a big way in 2016 in the Standing Rock protests, which were about a pipeline that was going to be built underneath a Native American reservation.
Keystone XL pipeline from Canada.
Exactly. And it became a sort of rallying point for a lot of different left causes. And one of them was Palestinian activism. And there were the slogan was "From Standing Rock to Gaza." In other words, these are both occupied territories. North America is occupied by settlers in the same way that Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza. And that these are sort of the same situation in two different places. In order to maintain that idea, you have to deny, or at least sort of overlook, the fact that Zionism was a self-consciously indigenous movement. It was a movement in which people said we were going back to our indigenous homeland that was taken from us almost 2,000 years ago, and we're going to create our own sort of self-determination in our historic homeland.
But it's not like all Jews had left. Jews have been living there for 4,000 years at least? 4,000 years?
Since ancient times, there were probably always at least some Jews in the land of Israel, but often very few, numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, say in the Middle Ages during the Crusader period. So there were never absolutely no Jews there, but it was not by any means a Jewish majority. And when the Zionists began to settle there in the 1880s, they were a very small minority. Jews were coming to settle in a province of what was then the Turkish Empire. that was predominantly Arab and Muslim. And so it's true, on the one hand, it's true that from the Palestinian Arab point of view, Zionists appeared as colonizers. They came from outside. They wanted to buy and take over land. And the people living there, the Palestinian Arabs, strongly opposed this from the very beginning, eventually by force. And it ended up being coming down to a war, which the Israelis won. And that's why there's a state of Israel, because they were able to win the war in 1948. But the idea that maybe both of these peoples have some sort of claim on the land, or that more than one people can be indigenous to a land, to a parcel of land, that really complicates the settler colonial framework, the settler colonial idea. It means that you can't just say these people belong here and these people don't. And one of the things I say at the end of the book is that in treating Jews in Israel as settler colonists who came from elsewhere and ought to go back to elsewhere, or that their possession of the land is illegitimate, it makes it into a zero-sum conflict which can never be resolved. I mean, the Israelis have nowhere else to go. In that way, they're unlike colonists in Algeria or Rhodesia and other places. There's no mother country. That's one of the chief ways in which Israel is not like a colony. It wasn't the colony of an imperial power. It was established sort of in defiance of imperial powers, in particular in defiance of the British Empire. And so if you say Israel must be destroyed, the Jewish state cannot exist, it should never have been created, then the 7 million Jews in Israel have no choice but to fight for their survival, right? The only way to a peaceful future is to acknowledge that there are two peoples here that both aren't going anywhere.
Well, unfortunately, one side has outright refused to acknowledge that. But if you take the settler colonial narrative and, okay, let's apply it to the people that we now call the Palestinians. We used to just call it the Arabs. Arabs came primarily, from my understanding, with the movement of Islam into the region. And Islam didn't exist until the 670s, early 700s, showing up in that part of the world. So would they therefore not also be settler colonialists?
Right. If you look at it historically, there's always going to be someone who was there before you. In this scenario, I think the reason why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict appeals to and energizes the ideology of settler colonialism is that you say it sort of overlaps with or is compared to different situations, so that there's a powerful white conqueror from Europe and a powerless non-white native population, and one commits genocide against the other, right? That's the way that the history of Canada and the United States is seen through the lens of settler colonialism. But in fact, that's not the history of Israel and Palestine. And right now there are about equal numbers of Arabs and Jews living between the river and the sea, about 7 million of each between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. So it's not a story of conquest and displacement and genocide. It's really a story of Jews gradually gaining a foothold in this territory and sort of wanting to defend it. Now, I think the situation is different if you look at the West Bank, which is occupied territory, where there is a sort of two-level society where the Israeli government attends to the needs of Jewish settlers and not to the needs of Palestinian Arabs. And I think that that's why traditionally those are the people who are called settlers, right? Jews living in the West Bank, which is not officially Israeli territory, have been called settlers on the West Bank. But in the view of settler colonialism, and you saw this very clearly after October 7th, all Jews anywhere in that region are settler colonialists. There's no difference between the West Bank and what is officially recognized as Israel. The Hamas attacks on October 7th were not in occupied territory. They were behind what's called the Green Line, the internationally recognized border of Israel. So when people say every Israeli is a target, they're not civilians, they're settlers, you're basically saying there's no solution to this conflict short of driving out all the Jews, or at the very least abolishing the Jewish state.
Well, you go to somewhere like Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a city that didn't exist previously. There was no settlement there. It's next to Jaffa, but it's its own city. That was built out of sand. It's still considered settler colonialist.
Definitely, and that's a classic example because it's an example of an Israeli city that sort of springs up next to and comes to absorb and displace an Arab city of Jaffa. And I think there's no question that just as with the history of the United States and Canada and Australia, it is a history of conflict and conquest, and in which the people who won were able to create a new society. But the way in which that happened in Israel is the scale, the time frame, and the results are so different from those other places that I think comparing them is really a tendentious ideological move. It doesn't accurately describe what's going on. So
what do we do about this this movement, this ideology? Is there a way to counter it? To me, it seems an incredibly misguided and at times dangerous ideology.
Well, one reason I wanted to write this book, and it's a short book written in about 6 months after October 7th, is because I think that this is an idea that usually people are exposed to in the academy and universities or in progressive spaces where they don't hear any dissenting voices. It's not sort of one idea among many. It's sort of like, this is the truth. This is the way we understand things. And I think that by shedding some sunlight on it and saying, actually, there's other ways of looking at these phenomena, there's other reasons to not use the settler colonial paradigm to understand these things, that's already a step in the right direction because it shows that there are alternatives. I think that it's an idea that is very entrenched in those places. It will not easily be displaced, but just having a sort of debate about it, discussion about it, and saying that, there are other ways that are maybe better ways to understand this history, I think that's the sort of contribution that I was hoping to make with the book.
Well, I just being aware of it would be, as you say, a good start, and perhaps making sure that if you've got kids or grandkids headed off to university, that they're made aware of a book such as yours and ideas such as yours, so that when they arrive, they've got some kind of defense, because this is overwhelming on campus. I live right next to the University of Toronto campus. I walk through it. You look at the signs posts on the lamps as you walk through, on the billboards. This is a dominant ideology, or not dominant. Perhaps that's the wrong word. It is pervasive, though. It is everywhere, even if many of the students are just ignoring it.
No, I think that's true. I think it's taken for granted in those places. And one of the reasons, I think, is that just to talk about the American context, over the last 10 years, American politics and culture have become so polarized that the extremes polarize each other, so that you have people on the left who say everything about American history is bad, or America is a settler colony and should not have existed. And then you have people on the right who say, well, we don't want to teach anything critical of American history. We only want to teach the things that can be celebrated. And then those extremes sort of drive each other further apart. And I think really what we need is a way of looking at our history that acknowledges the full truth, and also, which means the good and the bad, the hopeful parts, rather than the hopeless parts.
I would agree, and I've been making that argument for a long time. Adam, thanks so much for the time. You can get On Settler Colonialism. I'm looking at it right now. It's an audio book on Audible. You can get it on Kindle. You can get a hardcover. Thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please remember to hit subscribe, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you're listening. Hit subscribe. Help us out by leaving us a rating or review, and forward this episode on to your friends and family. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.